Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Sayonara Koenig-Hayes, and I'm a program manager at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. It's great to see the numbers popping up. I see that our colleagues are still joining us for this webinar. And while they come in, maybe we can already start with some introductions and opening this very interesting discussion. First, let me start with this common line of the HLPF. I've been waiting all of this time to use it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the globe you are joining us today. Please notice that this event is being recorded. If you have any problem with that, just be aware. Now, this is also the time to make sure that you are in the right virtual room. This is the event called Supporting a Decade of Accountability for the SDGs, which will focus on the need to enhance accountability for the 2030 agenda, particularly in light of the current circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the last day of the HLPF, and we are all tired and overwhelmed by the number of events taking place in parallel. But if you are still joining us today, it's because we have this shared concern that as we prepare to enter the decade of action for the SDGs, we have a special concern related to the accountability pillar of the Sustainable Development Agenda. As the report from the Secretary General says, the 2020 report on SDG progress, inequalities are still rising, the rate of climate change is worsening, the number of people going hungry continues to grow. And remember, this report uses data from April 2020, and we know that the impact of COVID-19 to societies and to the direct implementation of SDGs is already proving to be of catastrophic dimensions. Reports on increase of gender-based violence, millions of jobs being lost, health systems collapsing, people being pushed farther and farther into the poverty zone. And here we are, building back better. This is the call from the multilateral institutions and governments to ensure that we don't aim to return to the normal that has already proven to be fragile and incapable of protecting the most vulnerable when they need the most. A normal that allowed for exacerbated and unaccountable labor rights and human rights violations, attack to civic space and fundamental freedoms, that we don't do that we don't aim for that, but rather that we use our grief to rebuild our collapsed systems to be truly sustainable and resilient this time around. And for that, our checks and balances mechanisms need to be well functioning. And if we believe that the SDGs continue to provide this good framework to recover from COVID-19 pandemic and to build back better, then strengthening accountability of duty bearers on their commitment to the 2030 agenda, which includes fulfilling the human rights of all, is our best hope. So today we have an ambitious program with experts from different backgrounds and countries and who represent organizations and institutions which are critical pieces of this accountability puzzle for the SDGs. We have here with us John Romano, the coordinator from the TAP network, Marina Ponti, the global director of the United Nations SDG Action Campaign, Dana Busdesea, the partnership leader of advocacy and external engagement of World Vision, Yves de la Motte, senior manager at UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Carol Rask, a strategic advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and finally, Marian Garba, executive director of Fahimta Women and Youth Development Initiative of Nigeria, which is a partner of ActionAid Nigeria. We will hear more from our speakers very shortly, but for now, let me please encourage you to use the Q&A function that you find in this platform to interact with the speakers throughout the event. At this point, I believe that most of you have become experts in the dynamics of the virtual events, and one big advantage of having it this way is that you're allowed to gossip, to speak your mind, to ask questions, even while listening to the panelists. So here, this is not rude. Here, this is encouraged. So please use the Q&A function throughout. Now, let's also start first stretching our fingers to participate in a poll that should be coming to your screens any minute now. We first want to start here, as you can already see, having a feeling of who is in the room. So if you can tell us which stakeholder group you identify yourself with the most, and also from which region are you joining us today? Where are you based? I see that the fingers are being very stretching very well right now. We have already more than 20 people who are responding to the poll. Please feel free to join us. We have a lot of colleagues from civil society, from academia. We also have representatives from the private sector, multilateral organizations, governments representative as well, national human rights institutions. Seem to have a very diverse group joining us here today. We also have others. I always get curious to know what stakeholder group are you from? Then when we look at the regions of the world that you are joining us today, it's very well balanced, regardless of the different time zones that we have to deal with for this event. But we have the majority of our colleagues are joining from Europe, but it's very close to the amount of colleagues joining from Africa as well. Asia Pacific is very well representative. North America, which means, and Latin America, which means that people are waking up very early, very determined to join us in this conversation. That is really, really great. And finally, we have the results here. You can see now on your screen, civil society indeed is the majority joining us today. And I think if all of us from outside of civil society combined would amount to the weight of civil society in the room as well. So colleagues from academia, private sector, government, NHRIs, multilateral organizations as well. And here, as I said, Europe is the big winner of today. It's a very comfortable hour for us to join in Africa as well, but great to have also the colleagues in other areas. So now that we are already familiar with each other, with who is here, let's get to the first panelist today. It's my pleasure then to invite to the virtual floor, John Romano, please, the coordinator of the TAP network. John, you are going to tell us a bit more about the campaign for the Decade of Accountability for the SDGs. Can you please tell us an overview and the background for that, and how can our colleagues here in the virtual room support and join this effort?
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Sayonara, and thanks to everyone for joining us for this virtual event. I know Sayonara mentioned it's been a long couple of weeks for the HLPF. Even though it's been virtual, it has been there's been quite a lot happening, and so we're grateful for you making it through to this point and joining us today. So as Sayonara mentioned, I'm John Romano. I'm the coordinator of the Transparency, Accountability, and Participation Network. We're a civil society network of organizations from all around the world working on thematically on SDG 16, but also on accountability for the entire 2030 agenda. So we are just one of many partners as part of this campaign. I won't list them all off, but in the slide there, you can see all of our amazing partners on this campaign. I mean, for us, really, I mean, as a campaign, this is truly a multi-stakeholder effort. Each of these organizations are themselves networks of different stakeholder groups that we know are important for SDG accountability. Each of these stakeholder groups will play a key role. It's not just civil society that will play a role in holding governments accountable. I think those of us that work in the social accountability realm, we know that this is a multi-stakeholder effort. So we're also grateful for making this a really truly multi-stakeholder campaign. So the campaign is essentially, it's complementary to the decade of action that member states, that governments committed to at the SDGs summit last year. You know, obviously recognizing the impetus behind this campaign is, you know, recognizing that, yes, governments ultimately have the responsibility to deliver on the 2030 agenda. I mean, it's that in itself is also a multi-stakeholder effort as well. But the primary duty bearers for the 2030 agenda are governments. So, we're obviously very supportive of the Decade of Action, but complementary to that, we as a campaign and each of our organizations recognize that, yes, action should be the priority, but also that accountability needs to accompany that action. Otherwise, if we're being speaking quite frankly here, over the next decade, if we don't have accountability, we're going to end up in the same place that we are today, or the same place where we ended up with the Millennium Development Goals, where yes, there may have been progress over the next decade, but still we may be lagging behind or may have backslided in progress. So especially when it comes to the commitment to leaving no one behind, I think for us, the accountability piece of the 2030 agenda is a critical element, and again, speaking quite frankly, sometimes often overlooked. One of the, I'll talk just in a second about the ways that you can engage with the campaign. Again, this is a multi-stakeholder effort, but we also want this to be a campaign that many others that work on social accountability can see themselves in and can engage with us going forward. The primary way for you to engage with us currently is through what we're calling the Global SDG Accountability Survey. You can find information up on the slide there, but I hope many of you have had a chance to provide your reflections through that global survey. Essentially the intention behind that survey is for us collectively to unpack where people are seeing SDG accountability currently and where they feel things need to improve. All of this will then feed into what we're working on after the survey, what we're tentatively calling the Global SDG Accountability Report. This will be a first of its kind report on the state of SDG accountability, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, there are many ways to engage with the campaign. The first is the Global SDG Accountability Survey. It's available in 4 languages, English, Spanish, French, and Arabic at the moment. It's currently open until the end of July, so you do still have plenty of time to fill out this survey. So far, it's taken colleagues roughly 5 to 10 minutes to fill out the survey, so it shouldn't be a huge time commitment for all of you. I know everyone's very busy and also filling out many surveys these days. But I think for us, it's really trying to capture how people are feeling about accountability in many contexts. And also how people are experiencing the COVID-19 crisis and what kind of an impact that has on SDG accountability and the SDGs overall. So this is really important for us to ensure that anything that we do as a campaign is reflective of how people are feeling about accountability and how they would suggest how you all see SDG accountability advancing over this next decade. The second way that you can engage with us is by becoming what we are calling Sdg Accountability Champions. Basically, you can go on our website, you can register yourself as an Sdg Accountability Champion. You'll put yourself a push pin on a map and starting to build this global movement for SDG accountability. On top of the work that all of our organizations do and the work that we do as a campaign overall, we want this to be a growing movement that partners from all around the world can support and see themselves in. In terms of going forward, we want to build out a network that we can mobilize going forward. So I'll talk about it in just a second, but the Global SDG Accountability Report that we'll release late this year we'll also have a call to action for SDG accountability. And we want to use that call to action to mobilize a wide range of stakeholders to support SDG accountability going forward. The final way that you can engage with us is just by tweeting using the hashtag SDG Accountability. In addition to filling out the global survey, you can use this hashtag to share your stories. I mean, that's part of this this campaign, the impetus behind this campaign, and the report that we'll be working on is really, it's not just to take people's perceptions of how they're feeling about SDG accountability, but it's also to share stories if you have them. So we want to be able to showcase, especially in the long term, stories about how people are experiencing challenges around SDG accountability and how they're responding to those challenges. We want to showcase some really great case studies so that when colleagues and partners do encounter inevitable challenges when it comes to SDG accountability, we can learn from one another. So I think ultimately what we want from this campaign is for us to build out a network of peers working around SDG accountability, where we can ultimately share and learn from one another. And really that's how we envisage true SDG accountability through this campaign in the long term as well. Next slide, please. So just very briefly on the Sdg Accountability Survey. Again, we would really love to have your input. So if you haven't already, please do fill out that survey. You can find more information in this slide, but also more on our website. I don't want to unpack too much about the insights that we're getting right now from the survey, because I don't want to introduce any bias to the survey results. So I'll provide some just top line messages around what we've found up to this point about the survey that hopefully will not bias your responses. Basically, one of the main questions that we ask is, what are the main challenges that you're facing when it comes to SDG accountability? And you can see that the top 5 responses thus far: a lack of funding to support participation, engagement, and activities, lack of transparency from national governments, low overall awareness of the SDGs. I think this was a common theme that we're getting from some of the reflections throughout the survey. Lack of inclusion of marginalized and vulnerable communities with the SDGs. Again, a theme that's coming out particularly in COVID-19 times. And then a lack of institutional coordination across government. I think from some of the other questions that we have and some of the responses, one question that we had was if there exists currently an accountability mechanism in your country, whether that's a mechanism to engage in the VNR process or whatever it may be. We found that 63% of respondents had noted that there is an accountability mechanism in their country. But the perception of people's, how people perceive the effectiveness of these mechanisms doesn't necessarily correspond with the rate of the existence of these mechanisms. So I think that's telling us that, yes, the mere existence of a mechanism to engage with stakeholders is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily apply or mean that it's going to improve accountability. I think it needs to be an effective institution and mechanism. And then there's been really strong support for, again, creating platforms where we can learn from each other and share, and also have mutual ownership, not just as different stakeholders, but ensuring that governments can also become champions of this campaign as well. Just some really brief emerging trends from some of the open-ended responses. We've received some really great insights from all of you. I think that the rating questions are important, but equally important are the open-ended questions where you can share your experiences and share how you feel we need to take things forward. Basically, awareness raising is a critical first step. People need to know about the SDGs in order to know how to hold their government accountable to them. We need more capacity development and capacity building support, not just for different stakeholder groups, but also for governments as well. And so doing this in a collaborative effort, there's been many reflections on how that's been done up to this point. Better localization, making sure that the SDGs respond to local priorities and needs, obviously incredibly important. There's been a note about a lack of commitment from governments to the SDGs, and then therefore resulting in a lack of accountability. I think that's, again, a prerequisite to accountability is that your government and different stakeholders have to have buy-in in order for them to take it seriously and then to hold themselves accountable. And then we've received many, many inputs about the impacts of COVID-19. And I think this we'll be feeling the impacts of COVID-19 for quite a while. I think this is something that we're going to have to build into our response around SDG accountability. And I think that's become evident from this survey as well. Next slide, please. So finally, just wanted to provide just a really quick insight into what we're looking to do with this global SDG accountability report. We're looking to launch this report in late 2020. So once we obviously take the reflections on board from the survey, we want it to be a report that's reflective again of all of these inputs. So the report will basically, it'll be a synthesis of the inputs we receive from this survey. And then we'll analyze some of the key trends from, particularly from that survey. So what are people telling us in terms of the challenges? Where are the opportunities? How do we overcome some of those challenges? And where do we need to improve to ensure that we're advancing SDG accountability in this next decade? And then some reflections from some of these stakeholder groups about how different stakeholder groups can contribute to SDG accountability. Again, really showcasing the multi-stakeholder nature of this campaign and of SDG accountability more broadly. And then finally, as I mentioned before, some key recommendations for not just governments, but for all of the SDG community. Recommendations on what needs to happen next. And this will almost be an action plan for the campaign going forward of what are we going to do collectively to advance SDG accountability and what's the vision for that. And then finally, a call to action. Basically something where everyone from all around the world can sign on to advance this campaign and to advance this call to action. What it won't be, this report will not be a global progress report. I think there are many progress reports at the moment which already fill this gap. So it won't be a progress report. Again, it'll be a state of SDG accountability. And so again, what we hope for from this report is that it's reflective of your inputs through this survey. So again, the first step for all of you is to please contribute to the survey, the Global SDG Accountability Survey. And again, we want this to be an action plan. We want it to be actionable. We want colleagues to see themselves in it. We want people to see how they can contribute to this. And then going forward from here, ensure that we're building out a strong network of partners all around the world working on SDG accountability, bringing them all together and mobilizing to ensure that we have SDG accountability over this next decade. So you can find out much more on our website. It's really easy to find. It's just sdgaccountability.org/decade. So also happy to take more questions in the Q&A session as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, John, and for this very precise timekeeping that you had there for yourself. Very informative preliminary findings from this report by now in terms of challenges and trends related to SDG accountability. And we'll all be looking forward to this upcoming reporting, especially to get some more insights on what it is, this effective institutional mechanism that you mentioned as well, that will ensure interinstitutional coordination, effective participation and inclusion of all the stakeholders interested in this process. So thank you very much for this work and for this presentation, for this overview. It's great to see that there is a lot of energy going on in the chat already, people introducing themselves. Please remember to always use the Q&A function if you want to ask questions. And now we would like to invite you again to get your fingers ready to participate in the next poll that we have. I heard here in the chat that if you are joining from the browser, unfortunately you don't have access to the poll, but if you are doing it from the app, please join us there. This time around, we want to hear from your experience on a scale of 1 to 5. What is the level of satisfaction with accountability for the SDGs in your country? And also, how do you expect the COVID pandemic to affect accountability for SDGs in your country? We already have some very quick folks responding to the poll, and now we have more than 80 participants, so we expect to have a very high participation in the poll as well now. And we hear that most people so far are not very satisfied. But the good news is that some countries here are saying that they are including very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. That's also very good news. It shows to the amount of experiences that we are able to share and help each other building those structures that are necessary to strengthen accountability for the SDGs. But it still looks like the majority of the participants here, of the more than 50 people who have replied so far, are not very satisfied with the accountability of SDGs in their countries. And we also have our colleagues responding here to the second question, saying that most of them right now thinks that COVID-19 will not change much in their country in terms of accountability for the SDGs. But many of them also saying that it will significantly weaken accountability in their country. So you have right now access to the results of this poll to take a look of how your colleagues in the room feel about this. And while they take a look at the results, let me invite our next panelist today, who is Marina Ponti, the Global Director for the United Nations SDG Action Campaign. Marina, if you can please turn on your camera and enable your mic. Can you share with us your views on the challenges that have been brought up by the COVID-19 crisis, and what are the next steps at the UN to foster SDG acceleration and accountability in this context?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First of all, let me thank John and the colleague from the network for the invitation. We joined this campaign a few months ago, and we are extremely proud to be part of this network, because accountability is key to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also to any other important fight or goals that the society will like to put on, for the future. So I think building and investing in accountability is key. So having said this, COVID-19 has turned around our life and our societies. I think you, Sayonara, mentioned it very eloquently in your presentation at the beginning, that COVID has really impacted our society in terms of deepening inequalities or climate change, or of course, loss of life and jobs and dignity. So as I like to kind of summarize it in just one sentence, what I believe COVID has brought to light are the systemic failure of our society. So as you mentioned before, we want to use the opportunity of COVID having halted our societies to reimagine a better future, reimagine a better world, a world more equal, a world more active on climate action, a world more active on human rights, on health, on education, on inclusion. So we see this as an opportunity, as we call it, a turning point, for people and planet. We really see that there is an opportunity. Let me now talk about accountability. So I don't share some of the pessimistic views expressed from some of the colleagues in the room. I had concern about accountability pre-COVID. To me, a framework as the SDGs, which is multi-stakeholder, which in a way assign a primary responsibility to government, but also to the private sector, philanthropic community, civil society, individual, local government, parliamentarian. These very complicated and very diverse system makes accountability more difficult, more murky, more difficult to track, and allows people and leaders who don't want to be held accountable to get away more easily. And what COVID has brought back to us is a new important role for governments. We've seen in front of a pandemic, if before we were saying, you know, the private sector need to lead, etc., now only governments can rescue our society. Only governments have the resources and the mandate to rebuild, you know, our countries. So we see now an increased role of accountability and also an increased role around, you know, government and their role. And also something, you know, very important that has also shown, you know, during the pandemic. Edelman carried out a special survey on trust during the pandemic. And for the first time in many years, the trust from the citizen to governments and also local government has increased. So this to me offers again another opportunity for re-engagement with government. First and foremost, now in designing the recovery, we have an opportunity. Of course, we are all campaigning, you know, for the SDGs, but I think we have now an opportunity to work with government and to influence, so that the big decisions that are being taken now and negotiated at all levels in terms of environmental, you know, subsidies, or, you know, all the policy and financing which is linked to the recovery, we have the opportunity to make sure that these financing and this policy are really leading us to a just and sustainable recovery, which in a way is built on the pathway towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think we have a new opportunity to engage, and at the same time we will have new tools to then hold government to account, to the policy and to the funding, which is now appear at all levels to rebuild, you know, the economies and our society. So I share a little bit of optimism of that COVID has brought to us. And now moving to the action part, because we are an action campaign, you know, as you'll see from the slide, we really feel that we are at a turning point. We really feel that before asking for the SDG, many times we were told, oh, they're too costly, or it's not possible to change the economy, it's not possible to change, you know, business model or individual, you know, behavior and lifestyle. Now we've seen it's possible and it's happening. So I think there is a great call for people to engage, because the way the recovery will be shaped will affect our life, will affect our future, and definitely the implementation or lack of implementation towards the goals. So join us with many more groups. In September, we will be mobilizing with everybody under a very broad umbrella, a turning point for people and planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. This was a great way of starting this dialogue with our panelists, because I really hear your optimism, and indeed you point out very good opportunities that came up from a situation that is, you know, terrible, tragic, And this major call that you say that came to governments now, kind of a wake-up call for all of us, but also in terms of new tools and forms of engaging with governments as well. The trust building that came with that process, it gives us many good practices from there as well. There was a lot of new ways of sharing information with citizens that we were not anymore used to, that we can really build on the momentum that has been created with this new way of addressing and engaging governments and citizens as well. So thank you for reminding us of that. Our next speakers will continue to dialogue with our concerns related to the accountability structures, and will put light on more tools and initiatives and opportunities which can help us improve the levels of accountability for the SDGs at country and also global levels as well. So I would like now to invite Dana Busdesea, the Partnership Leader for Advocacy and External Engagement of World Vision. Dana, World Vision has launched a global emergency response to address the COVID-19 pandemic, which includes 70 countries, correct, across World Vision's operation. Can you tell us a bit more about this contribution and about World Vision's take on accountability and the SDGs? You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sayonara. Let me start my video here. Say hello to everybody. Yes, and just as you said at the beginning of the meeting, Sayonara, we are also acutely aware that this crisis the crisis that we are living is unprecedented, and it will generate irreversible changes. And most importantly, it will have definitely a severe impact on the most marginalized and vulnerable population. And this is the greatest concern of all of us, right? The figures that we are already seeing are devastating. We are talking about probably around 49 million people that will likely be pushed into extreme poverty by the end of this year alone. And World Vision's assessments that were published recently show that around 30 million more children will be at risk of disease and death, and 85 million more children could be affected by violence in the upcoming months due to the isolation measures. We are also estimating that about 85 million households and 110 million children might be going hungry in Asia alone, as COVID-19 will be plummeting the incomes, forcing millions of children to go hungry or to beg or to work or be forced into child marriage. And this is heartbreaking, and it all calls to all of us for action. Given the situation that we are living right now and what the future looks like for millions of people, including children, youth, women, people with disabilities, in the indigenous populations and others, for sure, accountability needs to play a significant part into the effort of implementing the SDG framework. And really, if we think about it, accountability lies at the heart of the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development and its SDGs. It is so because of the ambition and the transformative aspiration, as well as the call to include all the stakeholders, as Marina was saying earlier, and the responsible actors on the implementation and the delivery. And accountability really underpins all the structure and the implementation of the SDGs. And civil society, as a representative of civil society, I know that we do have a very important role to play. As the international community seeks to accelerate the action and delivery of the SDGs through the decade of action and delivery, addressing accountability as a critical action to monitor and to support governments in delivering their commitments is indeed an imperative. So we really welcome the initiative to advance a decade of accountability for the SDGs to mobilize a broad range of stakeholders. Last year, as you alluded, World Vision welcomed the publication of the SDGs Accountability Handbook by the TAM Network because one of the approaches proposed in the handbook is something that I personally witnessed as I was working in World Vision in Romania. It is very important for the civil society to have such a practical and concrete set of recommendations to support the delivery of the SDGs. Really this resource will be so important in advancing the decade of accountability. The approach that I was referring to, used by World Vision, is something that we have been tested and implemented in World Vision for a number of years already. And it is about citizens participating at subnational level, including collecting citizen-generated data. We call it Citizens' Voice and Action, and it is really a great methodology for local level advocacy that transforms that dialogue between communities and governments in order to improve services such as healthcare or education, which impact the daily lives of the children, their families, and their communities. And recently, as part of the response that we have launched, we adapted this methodology to address the COVID-19 impact and the challenges to bring evidence-based to emergency response and recovery. Most importantly, we want to hear the voices of citizens and the voices of the children in this process. And in addition to direct citizens' engagement, World Vision launched 4 years ago a global campaign anchored in the SDG 16. Our global campaign is called It Takes a World to End Violence Against Children. And it is our contribution to the SDG target 16.2, as well as directly contributing to at least 5 additional targets in other SDGs, including the interlinkages across all the SDGs. And we seek to contribute to violence prevention, which is such a key principle in the SDG 16. Through accountability for public policies, because these are key instruments for governments to implement programs that can bring about change to the most vulnerable groups, including girls and boys. In 2019, World Vision contributed overall to 360 changes or adaptation in public policies. All of this were addressing the root causes of vulnerability at the national or subnational level across 70 countries where we work. And these policies relate to at least 13 SDGs, particularly on the SDG 16. And at World Vision, we believe that as we all commit to build back better, to achieve Agenda 2030, we have a great opportunity to truly transform our societies and to fulfill our promise to a childhood and a future that are really free of fear and full of promise for every child. And we need to facilitate a process where the citizens, including children, can play a more significant role in holding their governments accountable for delivering on this promise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana, for this presentation and for bringing that to our attention, what World Vision is doing to raise the voices of children, which so often are left behind in those processes, right? There is still a lot of misunderstanding on how even to bring voices of children into public policies, and the process that you are doing to engage them, to create dialogue with governments and to improve the delivery of the services that are relevant to them. And by doing that, improving accountability for public policies as well. It's fascinating, and I'm sure our colleagues here will be interested in hearing more. If you do have questions for Dana or for any of the speakers, I remind you to use the Q&A function in the app, so please do that. In the meantime, we will hear our next speaker, Yves de la Motte, the Senior Manager at the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Yves, you are very well placed to enlighten us about the role of academia and research in supporting accountability for the SDGs. Can you give us some examples from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network on how this role has been played around the world?
Thank you so much, Sayonara. Yes, of course. Maybe just to start with a little bit of a background and introduction for those of you who may not know SDSN, we are the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We were launched by the previous Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2012, and our director is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Our role essentially is around three pillars. The first is global policy work. The second is education. We have a dedicated arm of SDSN called the SDG Academy, which offers free online courses on all topics of sustainable development. And then last but not least, we have our networks program where we mobilize academia really in the broad sense. This includes universities and research centers and even civil society organizations that have a strong research component. Today, we have 38 networks around the world that cover almost 1,500 universities, research centers around the world. And I'm so happy scanning through the participants list that I've actually seeing several of our networks represented. So hello to SDSN Germany, Greece, and Cyprus, who I spotted, and apologies if I didn't see you, and there are others of you on the webinar today. So I want to say a few words about the sort of unique role of academia and research in this decade of accountability. SDSN is very pleased and proud to partner with this initiative because we do see a very strong role for academia. And I think oftentimes accountability and advocacy are two things that are held very closely together. And advocacy is not typically a role that academic institutions take on. Though oftentimes in many countries, academia has an advisory role for government, also a training role. This advocacy, this responsibility to speak up is not necessarily something that's a natural role for academia. That tends to fall a little bit more on the civil society side. That being said, accountability is a lot more than just advocacy. And the role that academia and research can play is really on tracking information. So this can be monitoring the implementation of the goals, how the country is doing, whether it's on the mechanisms of implementation or whether it's on the actual outcomes, measuring the success of policies or even their existence at the beginning. And producing tools that can support accountability and tools that can also be used by other partners and actors in their advocacy work. So I can give a few examples of the work that SDSN does at the global level and then share some examples also from our networks at the national and regional level around the world. At the global level, I'm very proud to announce that yesterday SDSN launched in partnership with ESRI, which is a think tank working in particular on GIS software and data. We launched a new program called SDGs Today, which is a platform where we have essentially real-time data across many different SDGs, and we're tracking progress on these specific indicators at the global level. I would invite you to go to sdgstoday.org to have a look at these different data sets that we have carefully selected for this new platform. And of course, our flagship publication every year is what's known as the Sustainable Development Report. The 2020 edition was just launched at the end of June. This includes the Sdg Index and dashboards. The Sdg Index is a ranking of countries around the world in terms of their performance on the SDGs. And the dashboards are really a country-by-country analysis where we assign a traffic light score, so going from green, yellow, orange to red for really serious challenges. Green is goal achievement. And so for each UN member state and for each goal, we track the current status, and we also have a trend assessment in this report. So we goal by goal assess whether or not each country is actually on track to achieve each particular goal. So I would invite all of you to go to our SDG Index website, that's sdgindex.org, and you can explore the data and see where your country stands, and also have a look at where your neighbors stand, or maybe other countries at your sort of level of income, similar populations, to sort of get a sense of comparison about how your country is doing. I think this is a really powerful tool for advocacy and accountability. And our networks have really taken on this tool and appropriated it and made it their own. For example, our network in Malaysia has taken the results of the SDG Index and taken all of those goals that are red for Malaysia. I believe there were 3 goals that were red for Malaysia last year. And the network, which is hosted by Sunway University, set up a small research program with some of their policy researchers and made very specific recommendations. For example, on goal 2, very specific recommendations that were delivered to the government on what they can do to improve implementation and achieve goal 2 in Malaysia. And I'm going to just wrap up to say that universities, when they especially work together, have a really powerful voice. Universities have a very unique role in society. And I think through increasing mobilization, engagement, really explicitly in this accountability work and partnering across different stakeholder groups, there's really an important role for us. And I would encourage you all to reach out in your countries to your local universities, and you're more than welcome, of course, to reach out to SDSN as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eve, for showing us this real complementary role that academia can play in the accountability and advocacy package that we are talking about here to make progress on the SDGs, and also for bringing some of the specific tools that can help us track SDGs, including the Sdg Index, as you mentioned, and also some country examples as well. For those who have more questions for Eve, please use the Q&A, and we can continue this conversation afterwards as well during the Q&A session. For now, I would like to...
Hi, Nara. I just wanted to say that I'll put the links that I mentioned in the chat for those who didn't manage to catch them. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Perfect. That's excellent. And we'll also encourage all the other speakers as well to do the same. Use the chat to share your tools, reports, and everything that you're mentioning here during your presentation. So right now I would like to bring Carol to this virtual floor. Carol Rask, who is the strategic advisor and also my fellow colleague at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Carol, more and more we see that human rights and the 2030 Agenda are finding ways of bringing its synergies to life. And the COVID-19 crisis has also served as a sort of a wake-up call to accelerate the integration of SDGs and human rights as a way to build more resilient and accountable societies. Can you tell us a bit of how national human rights institutions such as the Danish Institute and human rights data is being used to improve accountability efforts for the SDGs? Carol, you are muted.
Now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I will speak to the role, as Sayonara said, of national human rights institutions in furthering accountability for SDG implementation, not least at the international, at the national level. Next slide, please. So I would like to start by highlighting the interconnectedness between human rights and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is, of course, an important basis for the engagement of national human rights institutions in this agenda. First of all, is the recognition in the declaration that a key aim is to realize the human rights of all, and that the agenda is grounded in international human rights treaties. And secondly, a study carried out by the Danish Institute for Human Rights found that over 90% of SDG targets were actually linked to international human rights standards. And this, for us, is an important compass, particularly when we know that the SDG Global Indicator Framework may leave out some important human rights dimensions. And thirdly, since we know that the current SDG Accountability Framework is maybe not as strong as we would like to see it, human rights, which are legally binding obligations on states, together with human rights monitoring mechanisms, can help fill this accountability gap, particularly if used in an integrated manner in SDG implementation. So next slide, please. So maybe before I move on to the role of national human rights institutions, just a very few words on what a national human rights institution is, or an NHRI. So a national human rights institution is an independent state institution. NHRIs are regularly assessed against the so-called Paris principles, those which are fully compliant, or A-status NHRIs, are those which, among other criteria, operate with autonomy from the government. They have a mandate to protect and promote human rights in national law. And in view, therefore, of the interconnectedness between human rights and the 2030 Agenda, NHRIs can be a crucial element in the institutional structure at national level for securing accountability for joined up SDG and human rights implementation. Next slide, please. So if we look very quickly at the global SDG monitoring framework itself, we note that there is actually an indicator, indicator SDG 16A1, which is aimed to monitor progress in the establishment of independent A-status NHRIs. And as you can see from this chart, from at the end of 2018, only approximately 39% of UN member states, or 77 member states, had A-status NHRIs. So much effort is thus needed to ensure more A-status NHRIs are in place to further integrated SDG and human rights accountability also in this new decade of action and accountability. So maybe the next slide. So turning explicitly to how NHRIs can further joined up SDG and human rights accountability, I would like to point to 4 main areas based on their mandates. So in terms of monitoring and reporting, many NHRIs undertake systematic analysis of national human rights situation and issue reports and recommendations. And these reports and recommendations can be used to guide national SDG implementation as they identify human rights gaps and can inform prioritization in implementation. NHRIs are also increasingly linking their reports to specific SDG targets and to the agenda in general. They can also use their mandate to advise governments on national human rights compliance. Some are also beginning to use this advisory function to advise on human rights SDG implementation. So some of our Latin American NHRIs participate in national advisory committees for SDG implementation. They can also, some NHRIs are mandated also to handle complaints on human rights violations in country, and an increasing number are linking these complaints as well to specific SDGs or the 2030 Agenda. These complaints can also identify systematic barriers to the implementation of certain rights and for certain groups, and can help identify priority areas for SDG implementation at national level. And finally, but not least, NHRIs as an independent state institution can act as bridges between the state and the private sector, civil society and rights holders. And this can, when it works best, help ensure that the rights of certain groups are included, not only in terms of the outcomes of SDG targets, but also in the SDG monitoring and reporting process as well. So next slide, please. So coming very specifically to what the Danish Institute for Human Rights is doing, and also in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have noted increasing restrictions on fundamental freedoms in some state responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, we know that the current SDG framework does not adequately allow for an effective monitoring of the enabling environment for human rights defenders and civil society, which of course is a key aspect for securing participation and accountability. The Institute has just recently published a paper exemplifying how human rights standards can guide the implementation specifically of SDG 1610 and other related targets for securing an enabling environment for human rights defenders. It exemplifies how we can use human rights standards to, for example, develop complementary national indicators that can more adequately monitor a state's commitment and efforts in this regard. So as this excerpt from our Human Rights Guide shows, there are over 17 international and regional human rights standards linked to this target alone that we can draw on to secure increased accountability. So next slide, please. But it's not only the standards themselves. There are also many recommendations coming from the human rights system that can be used as well in SDG implementation. So if we again return back to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that there are a number of emergency measures that have restricted fundamental freedoms, but many are also long unfulfilled human rights obligations, which can be tracked back to recommendations in these various human rights mechanisms. So in short, we think it is key that in the decade of accountability, we draw more on human rights standards and mechanisms in SDG implementation, monitoring and reporting processes to enhance accountability. And then just to conclude on the next slide, the Institute has also developed a number of tools, which you see here, to further integrated human rights and SDG implementation. They range from tools that link to human rights standards to the recommendations, but also tools specifically focusing on specific groups, like the one you see here in monitoring Indigenous people's rights, linking it to human rights and SDGs, and also to human rights education, SDG 4.7. So we would welcome you to explore and use this in your work, and you can find the link below if you would like to do that. And thank you very much, and over to you, Sayonara.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you also for starting by introducing to us what is this weird animal, which is national human rights institutions, and also to remind us that, to remind countries actually that, you know, efforts really need to be taken to establish national human rights institutions, not least because it's an SDG indicator and it would mean achieving that one goal that we set up in the global sphere, but particularly for the role that NHIs are playing in implementing some SDGs and in monitoring some key SDGs that are crucial for the accountability of the SDGs as well, the civic space, human rights defenders, and being able to make that connection with human rights mechanisms, human rights instruments, and the whole accountability architecture of human rights to improve accountability for the SDGs. So thank you very much for that. If colleagues have questions to Carol, please use the Q&A function to do that. In the meantime, I would like to invite you to our virtual floor here, Marion Garba, who is the Executive Director of Fahimta Women and Youth Development Initiative, which is a partner of ActionAid in Nigeria, and who is joining us today from the Bauchi state in Nigeria. Marion, you found your NGO to respond to the pressing social needs of excluded and disadvantaged people in the rural and urban communities across the northeastern part of Nigeria. Can you tell us about how your NGO and how civil society more broadly is furthering SDG accountability from the local level to the national level in Nigeria?
Hello, good day.
Hello, we can hear you.
And thank you for wonderful introduction. Great round to work today. I'm privileged to be with us with such a wonderful panel of speakers today to be able to share with you the importance of civil society organization. As I've been introduced before now, I work with civil society organization named Perimeter Women and Youth Development Initiative, which is part of the Inclusive Forum for Accountable Society, IFAS. IFAS is a forum that was established as a result of our partnership with Action Aid Nigeria, and we are doing a lot of activities, and inclusions is part of what we are doing to be able to reach both people with disability, youth, women, and whatever. We have monitored activities of SDG in Bauchi Field Office. Bauchi is located in northeast Nigeria with the aim of advancing gender equality. The multi-stakeholder coalition of IFAS includes conducted participatory monitoring initiative on education and gender. That is to say something about SDG 4 and SDG 5 in 10 communities across the 3 senatorial districts of our state. Advocacy was held and dialogue with Bauchi State SDG office, which led to deepening partnership with state government, coalition of CSOs, pressure groups, and local women groups. That is part of the inclusion. We also established the election of IFAS members in leadership position at state and local government administration level. This partnership has been very, very useful to us. It has made us to achieve a lot of things, and we have a way forward in presenting our activities and then achievement. Looking to the
Mariam, we seem to have lost you. Perhaps if you can hear us, if you would perhaps turn off your camera, maybe that would improve connection at your side. It seems like we still can't hear Mariam. She is still connected, but it looks like we are facing our first technical problem after more than an hour of event. That's okay. It seems like John and Claudia, we might have lost Mariam. If you can try to get her back to the call. In the meantime, perhaps we can now come to some of the comments and questions that our participants have been posting in the chat and in the Q&A box. And we received just a reminder here from a participant saying that partnerships with the private sector and civil society seems to be still key for the SDGs, for accountability, for rebuilding during the pandemic, during and after the pandemic. And there is really a call for governments to understand those partnerships, to align with SDGs and to be more open for partnerships and also for improving partnerships between private sector and civil society in that context as well. Then we have some questions here. Perhaps, Marina, if I could come to you with a question that it's related to, maybe it can relate to one of the points that you mentioned in your presentation about the new ways of engaging. And a participant is saying that, you know, in many countries, including many countries in Africa as well, there is not so much openness for governments to work with civil society, to collaborate with civil society, that there is also often the context that government sees civil society as a political opposition, and that shouldn't be like that. And the question is, what can we do about it? Is there lessons or inspirations from, you know, that optimism that you were seeing on the new ways of doing politics and engaging with civil society that comes from the COVID-19 that could help build these relationships and build the trust and break some of the barriers that are making it difficult for governments to partner with civil society for accountability on the SDGs?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think you pointed out a very important point. When I was sharing my optimism before was for the exercise of funding opportunity that this devastating health, economic, and social and political crisis are brought upon us. But I didn't want to convey a kind of a general optimism on how, you know, government are, you know, open or transparent, or how government are putting people first, you know, in their priority. So I know the struggle is very severe, and I know every country is different. Some democracy are more transparent and are more equipped to integrate the voices of people, and other just don't. And even some democracy who used to have an okay record in really listening to people and to concern are now also moving away from that. So we see, I think, which is alarming, the shrinking of civic space across regions, and also where in theory, you know, democracy are up and running, we see, for instance, the use of Twitter sometimes as a way to announce policy that used to be decided into the cabinet of government or were voted by the parliaments, and now are just announced from individual homes, you know, through Twitter. So I think there are worrying, you know, symptoms which we all see in front of us. But at the same time, every challenge brings an opportunity. Let me tell you, and I'm glad there is a colleague on the podium from Nigeria. We gave one of the winners of our SDG Awards last year was the Follow the Money Nigeria. So using social media, which again may be a tool that undermines democracy and real processes of consultation, they've used the social media to track government spending and to launch a community engagement activity that led to government where before, you know, funding would disappear for corruption, then was tracked, social media campaign were launched, and the money finally reached the intended use. So it's complex, and I don't want how to, but you know, the struggle should continue, and every challenge of open up a different window. So ability to continuously change strategy and adapt with the rapidly evolving scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina, and for reminding us as well of the potential of using social media as well as a tool for improving accountability and also for bringing the voice of civil society up there. And it's true, now we have Marian back on the call. So Marian, would you like to complement Marina, perhaps with a more, you know, in-country perspective on what can we do to improve collaboration between government and civil society from the perspective of the work that you are doing there in Nigeria and from your NGO?
Accept my apology, please, for the break in transmission and disconnect. We have a lot to do, and in different ways, civil society constraining the decades of accountability. Joint research, we can encourage joint of research and harmonize report to support MDAs, ministry, department, and agencies for inclusive planning and implementation. We can also work at different locations as we play a vital role in information sharing and awareness creation. We must use our collective voices to say no to corruption and injustice. We stand a better chance to engage with any government plan to review and provide people's voices. We must build capacity of people to engage at different levels, linking communities to national and state and international. More than ever before, we connect more efficiently and partner with relevant agencies to generate required data that will facilitate effective planning and monitoring. Bauchi IFAS team activity accountability, we have policy influencing, where we talk about violence against people with Prohibition Act, which has been passed from the House of Assembly, awaiting our governor's signature. And we are talking about 35% affirmative action, inclusive governance, including budget tracking, particularly specific gender budgeting in every activities of the government. We also intend to build capacity for CSO on social audit, like I said, budget tracking and defense up to utilization level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I'm glad that we managed to bring you back on board for this conversation. Thank you. I have now a question for Eve. If there is kind of a technical question for you related to the SDGs today and the SDGs tracker, in terms of understanding the difference between those two tools, and also asking if you are dealing here with a software when you're building those tools.
Yes, thank you, Sayonara. I was busy typing responses in the Q&A. So if you guys click on the Q&A, if you look under the answered section, I wrote up quite a detailed response. But essentially, SDGs today is not a sort of national level per SDG tracker. It's a unique portal that specifically focuses on real-time data sets. It's an open access platform, and it's really about seeing where the world is right now on sustainable development measures. We're essentially collecting existing data sets that have been really vetted by a team of experts and making them available here on a platform that also links to GIS training and a lot of other tools. So yes, there is software behind it that we've developed with ESRI and the National Geographic Society. So it's more than just a platform for real-time data, which already would be completely unique, but there's a lot more on there. So I would encourage you all to have a look and explore.
Thank you very much, Eve. Now, Carol, if I can have you back here, there is a question as of how many African human rights institutions are not independent? And then there is a broader question of what to do. What are the steps necessary to be taken to build independent national human rights institutions?
Thanks, Sayonara. I think, as I showed in my chart in my presentation, we're lagging behind in the number of independent national human rights institutions. So there are only 39% that are independent. So it's not surprising that we see also a large number in Africa that are not independent either. I think in terms of the specific steps, as NHRIs, of course, we can build capacity, and we can be in dialogue with government to create the conditions to become independent, to be more independent and operate more independently. But I think we also need other actors. I mean, I think we've shown in the chart that this is also a gap in the implementation of the of the SDGs, at this rate of progress, we will never have 100% A status NHRIs by 2030. So I think we also need other actors as well to call nationally for the type of framework conditions that will allow NHRIs in their countries to operate with independence. So that would be my my response to my colleague from Africa.
Great, thank you very much, Carol. And I have two open questions here that I would like to give the floor to whoever would like to take from our panelists today. One of them is asking, how do you propose to address the great power imbalance and resources between governments and citizens? Would anyone have 5 cents on this very complex question? I don't see any volunteers. Can I volunteer someone maybe for the next question, which is asking if there's any opinions out there in regards to the lack of existence of national legal frameworks for governments to collect and publish SDG data. Would perhaps Evie, would you like to address this question on the existence of national legal frameworks for data and for data collection and for data dissemination as well?
Yeah, I mean, most countries have national statistical offices that have the legal mandate to collect much of the data that is required under the sort of SDG monitoring and reporting framework. And most countries that I'm aware of have mandated their National Statistical Office to do the monitoring of the SDGs. In some cases, some countries have also developed their own indicator frameworks that are much broader and more vast, which go beyond the sort of minimum requirement of the global set. And in other cases, countries have been quite overwhelmed by the 242 indicators and have kind of, thrown up their hands and said, this is too much, this is too overwhelming, we can't disaggregate to the degree that we're being required. And so overall, I would say the reporting has been a bit underwhelming. And I think that's why we need other actors to step in, academia in particular, which has a deep expertise with data, a long history doing this kind of work, and civil society as well. I think we need to go beyond and outside working just with the NSOs to find ways to collect all of this data.
Thank you very much, Eve. And now I hear that John is volunteering to give his 5 cents on the question of the power imbalance. What do you propose to address the great imbalance between governments and citizens in relation to effective power and resources?
Yeah, thanks, Sayonara. Yeah, I think it's a great question, a really deep question that maybe we could even spend days talking about this. I mean, it's I think especially in COVID-19 times, I think we've seen some of the cracks, whether it comes to inequalities or just in general, just cracks in societies. I think we've seen those deepen. And I think this pandemic is kind of exposing those cracks and widening those gaps. I think in terms of how we do things going forward, I mean, I think again, this is it's another reason why we need to ensure accountability for the SDGs. I mean, I think that the challenge that we have in many countries is that governments are not responsive to citizens, and I think far too often governments are responsive to special interests and to money. And I think the reference to the Follow the Money campaign earlier is a great one, because I think ensuring that how do we actually get governments to listen to citizens when in a lot of countries that's not their priority, because in one way or another, the system is rigged against individual citizens and against society, I mean, as a whole. I think for in countries where civic space is shrinking in particular, and this is maybe also answering another question around, you know, what do we do in cases where governments aren't so willing to collaborate with civil society or other stakeholder groups? I think in particularly challenging cases where civic space is shrinking, I think the assistance of external actors like international organizations or national human rights institutions, I think is hugely critical, because I think speaking from a civil society perspective, at least, in many cases, when we talk about holding government accountable and the approaches to doing that, like maybe putting together a spotlight report, for example, or shadow report, in a lot of cases, citizens or civil society can't play this role because they will be they'll be cracked down by government or prosecuted or even imprisoned. I think in a lot of cases we need, as I say we as in international organizations and networks, particularly those of us in this campaign, need to figure out how we better support some of these groups that may be marginalized or sidelined from conversations, and even worse, actually punished for their work around accountability. So there's a lot of work from big international organizations helping to support that. And I think it's a kind of an existential question and challenge for us as a campaign going forward, is how do we support this especially challenging circumstances? So I don't think I answered that question very thoroughly. And again, I think we could spend days to unpack that further, but yeah.
Yes, that's a very ambitious question indeed, but you really shed some lights into some possibilities and things that we can do to progress on that. And just one last question before we wrap up. Eve would like to address the participant who asked, how can we encourage governments to get more involved in SDGs as opposed to other platforms?
Thank you so much, Sayonara. This question speaks to me because I'm based in the SDSN Secretariat Office in France. And France really takes ownership of the Paris Agreement, but the SDGs have not been a politically powerful framework here. So we're working with a lot of organizations here to try to get the government to take it on board. I have a great example of how you can do that with our colleagues in SDSN Spain. Around the last Spanish elections, they found that none of the political parties were really sufficiently addressing this interconnected framework of sustainable development. And SDSN Spain, the vice chancellors and rectors of about 50 of the leading Spanish universities all co-signed a demand to the political parties saying you must articulate a response in your platform about how you're going to address the SDGs. And all the political parties did in fact do this. This was the first time this has basically ever happened. And so this really speaks to the power of organizing as a network, the sort of particular role of universities, and this sort of advocacy, outspoken role of holding to account political leaders and political parties. So if you're in a country where elections are coming up, even at the local level, this is hopefully an example that can inspire you as well.
I realized that I was on mute, sorry. Thank you very much, Eve. And we're really coming to a close now of this very interesting event. Before I proceed, I would just like to ask Marianne if she would have any final comments to this, to give a special access because you have faced technical problems. So if you would like to address this with one last comment, please do so.
Okay. Thank you very much. I like to make this remark by appreciating you for making me part of this laudable event, and I have increased my own knowledge and capacity from the experience I've shared from all other partners that came around the world. I have gotten a lot of information that will help me in my future endeavor. I appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And now we're really coming to a close, but just to remind us today of the wealth of information that we got here, starting from World Vision, where they have shown great adaptability in terms of building up quickly responses according to the needs generated by COVID in the 70 countries that they operate, and adapting its approach to citizen participation, including with citizen-generated data efforts and other accountability approaches to the to the COVID-19 context. We heard as well from SDSN and the role that academia is playing, this very important role in SDG monitoring and review around the globe, such as mobilizing universities around the SDGs, and not least by providing support to governments in implementation and monitoring efforts through independent and scientific expertise. We also heard from the IHR on how NHRIs are stepping up to complement the accountability architecture of the SDGs, and in particular we heard about the paper on accountability for SDG 16.10 on fundamental freedoms in terms of using human rights standards, principles, and mechanisms to fill the accountability gap in the monitoring of an enabling environment for human rights defenders. And we also heard from Fatima Women and Youth Development Initiative from Nigeria, and in particularly how they are organizing themselves to provide social accountability, not least by also participating in auditing budgets and really getting their hands on the ground in that process in Nigeria. And all of these experiences come together here at the campaign for a decade of accountability for the SDGs, which is about bringing those voices together, creating a platform for coordinated efforts to improve SDG accountability, and doing that by leveraging all of these experiences, expertise, and tools from actors from across all sectors, building on human rights knowledge, promoting scientific and evidence-based approach, empowering civil society, coordinating with the UN and member states to raise the call for accountability in this decade of action for the SDGs. And they are not waiting for the momentum to happen, they are really creating it. So please visit the website that has been posted on the chat there, learn more about the campaign, and join this movement. And now I would like to thank you very much for the organizers of this event, John Romano, TAP Network, and all of the other organizations involved in the campaign for a decade of accountability, including Forus, Together 2030, the global call to action against poverty, and especially thank you to all of you who joined us today in this last day of HLPF and is still here with us to the concluding of this event. It has been a pleasure to lead this great lineup of panelists, and I wish you all a great morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sayonara, for shepherding us through this event as well. Great, thanks everyone.
Thank you, bye.
Bye everyone.